Now, as we said before, carbon is used to make up a whole bunch of things. It is found in all living things. So now let's move on to defining some specific terms that you are going to hear throughout the rest of the semester that pertain to carbon. The first term you will likely hear a lot in subsequent biology and chemistry courses is organic compound. In science, organic simply means carbon containing, or something that contains carbon. And compound just means compound. So when you hear someone say organic compound, they're simply just referring to a compound that has carbon in it. One type of organic compound are hydrocarbons. Hydro, meaning hydrogen, and carbon, just meaning carbon. So a hydrocarbon is simply a molecule consisting of only hydrogens and carbon atoms. Now, there are 4 main types or classes of organic compounds found in all living things. We have our carbohydrates, our lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, if all of these compounds are built from carbon molecules, what makes all of them different or unique? Well, that's largely thanks to each compound's functional group. So let's talk about functional groups. Functional groups are groups of atoms in a compound, such as the hydroxyl group in this alcohol, which is shown here, that determine the chemical behavior of the compound, how the compound basically interacts with other molecules as well as its environment. For example, hydroxyl groups, like the one shown here, are considered polar. So it would cause this compound to be attracted to other polar molecules. Imagine at the core of every organic molecule are carbons and hydrogens. The other bits, usually found at the end of the molecule, are what help make molecules special and unique. These other bits being their functional groups. Here are some great examples of some of the most common functional groups. As you can see, each functional group have properties that contribute to the compound they are found in. Keep in mind that these rectangles you see here just represent the rest of the compound. For instance, if we were looking at an amino functional group, the whole compound would look, or could look, something like this. Also keep in mind that a lot of people tend to write in shorthand, so while this is what an amino group would kind of look like if it was written fully out, a lot of people will use shorthand and instead write something sort of like this, where instead of writing out the N's with their 2 H's, they'll just write NH2. Now, there are some really important functional groups you are going to see throughout the semester. So as a baseline, it's important you are at the very least familiar with these functional groups' names, what they look like, or what their structure is, the shorthand way people write them, their properties, and lastly, what characterizes each of these functional groups. Okay? Now, before we dive in, just to clarify, I'm going to be drawing some red boxes like this moving forward. Those red boxes just represent the carbons and hydrogens and other atoms that are attached to these functional groups. Basically, they represent the rest of the compound that is coming off of the functional groups. Sound good? Okay. And with that, let's get started by going over a functional group we see everywhere, and that is our hydroxyl group. Now, you will not have a checking question following this part of the discussion where we're going over the specifics of functional groups. However, you will need to know the properties of these groups for your first larger assignment, such as an exam, okay? So to make sure that you have proper study materials, I highly recommend that you actually copy down the table that I'm about to make for you in your notes. Sound good? Okay, so starting with the structure of our hydroxyl group. This guy we see everywhere. We have an oxygen and a hydrogen coming off the end or coming off the side of a chain. Sound good? So shorthand, this would be OH, oxygen, hydrogen, and the key properties for a hydroxyl functional group are, number one, they are polar. And because they are polar, that implies they are also hydrophilic. Remember, water's polar, so if we're dealing with a polar molecule, that means we're also likely dealing with something that is attracted to water, or something that's hydrophilic. So this is characterized by the presence of an oxygen and a hydrogen simple structure. Okay? Next we have our sulfhydryls. Sulfhydryls, as the name would imply, has a sulfur and a hydrogen. Sulf for sulfur, hydryl for hydrogen. So shorthand, we have sulfur and hydrogen. These guys are also polar, and the key characteristic here, they are characterized by the presence of that sulfur. Next we have our methyl group, classic. Methyls are a carbon with 3 hydrogens, so CH3. These guys are non-polar functional groups. So thinking about hydrophobicity, are we dealing with something that's hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Right, hydrophobic. If it's non-polar and water is polar, that means it will not be attracted to water, right? So this is characterized by carbon with 3 hydrogens, okay? The carbon and hydrogen simple structure. Next we have our carbonyl. Carbonyls look something like this. Carbon bound to an oxygen, double bound to the oxygen. And the key is that it's in the middle, like so. So we have our carbon-oxygen in the middle, surrounded by things. Properties include it being polar, and it's characterized by carbon and oxygen bound to 2 organic or carbon-based side groups. Something else that I want to point out here too is that this double bond here actually increases the polarity of this molecule. Next, we have carboxyl groups. You're going to see this a lot. These guys are also sometimes called acidic carboxyl groups, and you'll see why in just a sec. All right, so starting off here, here's what they look like. And so drawing it out shorthand, we have carbon, 2 oxygens, and a hydrogen coming off the end or branching off from a molecule or compound. These guys release protons easily. Because they release protons easily into the solution, or hydrogen ions into a solution, they are considered acidic, right? Remember, the more protons we have in a solution, the more acidic that solution is considered to be. So these guys are characterized by a central carbon bound to an oxygen and a hydroxyl group, or an OH group. Next, we have our amino group, which is our nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. Now, conversely, amino groups accept protons very easily and can form NH3 from that, okay? Since amino groups can remove hydrogen ions from a solution and accept those hydrogen ions or protons from that solution, they are considered basic, right? They can lower the acidity of a solution because they can take protons from that solution and suck them up. Make sense? Amino groups are characterized by the presence of a nitrogen branched structure. Cool? And last but not least, we have our phosphate group, which is a little bulky, but it basically is a phosphorus with oxygens and hydrogens coming off of it. Sound good? And a lot of people with shorthand will actually just do a P with a circle around it. You could write out POOOOHH if you really wanted to, or PO4H2, right? But most people just do the P with the circle to represent a phosphate group. Now, phosphate groups release hydrogen very easily, similar to carboxyl groups. So they release those protons into solutions very easily, very readily. And because of that, they are also, like carboxyl groups, considered acidic. And these guys are characterized largely by the presence of that phosphorus complex structure. All right, and that's the basic overview of the important functional groups. So if you see any of these functional groups coming off as something in the future, which you definitely will actually in this upcoming discussion, I want you to be thinking of these properties. Sound good?
Now, sometimes you may come across two molecules that have the same molecular formula, such as the two shown here, which when you write both of them out, you can see they have 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens, but can exist in different forms. Again, such as in this example here. We can see that the location of 1 carbon and 3 hydrogens are in a different location in one molecule than another. When we come across something like this, we call these isomers.